for the first time, I feel that our department can actually reach more teachers and more teachers can access us compared to the past, right? Because in the past, they would have to rely on site-specific or district-specific, one-size-fit-all professional development. Whereas these days, we're able to customize that, be more flexible with that, have them kind of revisit that learning. We've actually been able to do more professional development and teachers have been able to access us more this time around in the last 3 months compared to what we've been able to do the last 3 years, right? I'm Rowena Mak. I'm the District Coordinator for Services for English Learners at Saddleback Valley Unified School District. It is a TK to 12 district in Orange County, South Orange County to be specific. We have an overall population of about 28,000 students, with about 5,000 of that being English learners. So our department here oversees everything from soup to nuts that have to do with English learners, from identification, reclassification, assessment, but also on the teaching and learning side of things. So that's providing a conceptual framework for teachers to really implement the ELD instruction with fidelity, professional development for teachers and for site admins, as well as design of courses that are really going to be effective for English learners.
Okay, Rowena Mak from Saddleback. Let us know first what your district has planned for going back to school. Is there a plan yet? And how is that plan affecting sort of the way that you're thinking about providing equitable instruction for your English learners?
Absolutely. We have a plan. It has just been approved by the board a couple of weeks ago. And that is to go back to distance learning, full distance learning in the fall. Having that said, we did put out a school selection survey for our parents that once we're able to return back to school physically, they will have a choice between continuing with virtual learning or going back to school on a hybrid model. So specifically for the English learners, I think what we have to keep in mind is what were the lessons that we learned from the spring when we were kind of forced into the situation of distance learning with very little preparation. So that for us is kind of access to materials and education for parents so that they could support their children at home. So that has been something that we're really kind of focusing on. What were the lessons we learned from that experience to support our ELs, and how are we going to grow from that experience and make some improvements for the service of our English learners.
Yeah, so it seems like many districts you're going back remote, all remote, and then there's going to be some sort of choice as you come back. That seems to be a common theme. Although one thing that you mentioned is the choice to go back hybrid. It seems like a lot of districts are doing kind of one or the other at this point, that they're sort of not doing the hybrid model, mostly because it's just so much planning for teachers because they have to plan for every part.
Right.
Curious as to what, I guess it's specific to the English learner demographic, but in general, what was behind the choice of going back hybrid once you finish that remote piece, or having the choice to do that?
Sure, we took a lot into account. So of course, state and county guidelines as to what we're able to do. But very early on, we also took the pulse of the community. So we did parent surveys, teacher surveys, student surveys as to how they feel about this whole situation. And it really was very split. We did it in March and we re-administered the survey again, and it continues to be split. And I think that while we're not going to be able to have one plan or 2 or 3 plans that's going to satisfy the needs of all families, I think what we're trying to do is just to try and accommodate everyone to the best of our ability so that we could support their comfort level, yes, but at the same time, we're not shortchanging them in terms of the instructional experience that they're going to get out of it.
Right. Yeah, having that flexibility, it's hard because you have, like you said, it seems like it has been sort of split down the middle. It's very contentious, and understandably so. But it seems like you're putting a lot of focus. You said those 2 things were making sure that students have access to the materials and the tech tools probably that they need to be able to and just the
Mm-hmm.
Wi-Fi, and also making sure that you're engaging with families and educating
Right.
families. Talk to us a little bit more about that, because that's also been a key theme, and I think one that has been delightfully put in the spotlight, the importance of family engagement.
Yeah, so especially for our ELs, it has been, or maybe I'm a little bit biased in saying, especially for the
No, I'm
ELs,
with you.
that
I'm with
has,
you.
yeah, that has been a great, great emphasis for us back then, and even so more now, right? So what we have at each site is what we call bilingual parent advocates or community liaisons. So we have that at each site. So very early on, we took that group of people and we really wanted to understand what are some of the challenges that EL families are having at home with respect to supporting their children. And there were some unique things that are only particular for ELs. Whether they are right or wrong, or whether they are accurate or not, they are experiences that our EL families are having, namely with respect to understanding how to support their students' learning at home.
Hmm.
Whereas some families and some students had the privilege, for however challenging it was for parents, but at least having one parent at home that was there side by side with them to either give them some assurance, to help them log on to their learning management system, or to even check their work. Our EL families didn't always, our students didn't always have that, right?
Hmm.
So we had to think about how is it that we're going to support the parents with whatever resources that they have and whatever comfort level they have in their disposition with learning, so that our EL students could have that benefit as well.
Right. Yeah. And that is right in the crosshairs of that equitable experience. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing a lot about that. And certainly, in many ways, I was lucky. I have 4 children of my own, but I
Mm-hmm.
was sort of doing this and also supporting them with their work. But I had the luxury of working from home. A few
Right.
of these podcast episodes, you could probably hear my kids and my dogs in the background, but nonetheless, it was challenging. And I would add, like, the other thing that I think is important, is that nice for kids to have, is for parents to just be sort of frustrated with them, to
Right.
be next to them, be like, oh, this is really hard.
Yeah.
When you're not involved and you're working on your own, because through no choice of your own, it can be difficult to empathize with what they're going through, and vice versa.
I experienced that personally as well. And I'm an educator, and I'd
Yeah.
like to believe that, I have a fair amount of understanding about those learning tasks that my children were getting. And I felt that same frustration. And in some sense, it's like, I should be able to do this a little bit better. But at the end of the day, I am a human being and I'm also a working parent. So I think that just giving us ourselves the grace to kind of, live in that moment, and probably just to be compassionate to everyone and everything about the unique experiences we were facing.
Yeah, I've heard that word a lot. Yeah, that expression, give ourselves grace. I like it. Um, so what's top of mind for you right now? You just kind of gave us a little bit of an outline of what you've done and where you're going. But what are your concerns right now? I hope nothing's keeping you up at night. But if there was one thing, what would you say it was at this point?
I I think it's okay to keep it up, for it to keep me up at night, right? Because I think those are the types of things that, on my way to work, on my drive to work, and I'm going like, I really need to keep on figuring out what this looks like. And that's how it is that we can help teachers understand that just because distance learning is happening doesn't mean they minimize the learning opportunities for ELs.
Hmm.
And it is above and beyond what they need to provide for non ELs, right? Because they are developing content language, but they're developing language at the same time. So both of those things have to be supported. So what's keeping me up is, are our students going to have access to those, or will they just be kind of like one size fits all because it's challenging for the teacher, therefore you're all going to get the same thing, right? So from our department, how can we put an infrastructure to make it easy for teachers to kind of say, I know my ELs need something, but I really can't right now. But what if there were resources that say, I know my ELs need that. And look, there is this
Hmm.
something that the Services for English Learners Department built for me as a starting point, so that I can calm down and not be so overwhelmed that this is so difficult. Because once I see it, it's like, oh, okay. So Steve, allow me to be a little bit more specific. So one of the things that's very important for language learners are those opportunities to develop their oral proficiency, right? The good thing about that, so if you think about that, first of all, especially for teachers that may not have a background in language development or linguistics, teaching that, right? You may think, I don't even know how I'm going to do that, right? So it's incumbent upon our department to say, actually, there are a lot more tools and resources for you to do that right now. You have your Flipgrid, you have your Seesaw, and they are relatively easy to set up. And with those things, you're actually increasing the likelihood that your students have practice on oral proficiency
Yep, I love it.
compared to when they were in the classroom and you had to rely on
Mm-hmm.
calling on them one-on-one.
So we're getting into the affordances now that
Right,
online learning provide. Yes, please
right.
continue.
Yeah, yeah, so those are the types of the things. But so for me, I have to position myself from really the mindset and the emotions of all of our stakeholders. What are our parents going through, but what are our teachers going through as well? Yes, that there's a lot of responsibility on the teachers, and it's really incumbent upon them to provide these learning opportunities for students. But we have to remember, when they go home, they're experiencing the same thing as us, their parents as well,
That's right.
right? And so we also have to equip them with something to begin with so that they can build from that and not just say, hey, teacher, this is your job, so do it. That's not fair either.
So are tools like Flipgrid and Seesaw and the others that you mentioned, are those the part of the solution to the issue? Is that, what's helping you kind of process how you're going to go about supporting these teachers? Or is it, I mean, it's got to be more than that as well in terms of like
Yeah,
equipping them with it. I mean, I love the idea of those tools. I mean, those are great tools and ones that I've used as well. But how do you sort of calm a content teacher down and say, look, you can provide equitable instruction to these students and you can still give them what they need to improve in both language and content. Here are some of the tools that you can use to do it. But does something come before that in that equation in terms of your collaboration with them?
right. Because it's only going to go a long way if I told them Flipgrid and Seesaw does this, right?
Right. I mean, we've
Yeah,
all received those huge lists of tech tools,
right.
right? Like
What, what,
here's a
right.
giant list, go for it. But then you just get
Yeah.
overwhelmed.
So on that, Steve, we definitely experienced that. So March 13th came around, and by March 15th, our department built an ELD resource site,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we started really with by level. So, like, what are the resources for elementary teachers? What are resources for secondary teachers? But we knew that at the secondary level specifically, we had to reach the content area teachers. So I'm a history teacher. I have some of my students that are ELs and some of my students that are not ELs. And frankly, I'm really scared about the supporting ELPs because I think it's this huge thing that's not attainable unless I was an English teacher. And that's not really true. So what we did is we created office hours and we would invite content area teachers to come there with us and really just show us what you're doing and show us what you're frustrated about in your lesson development. And then as a result of that, we were able to build subsequent webinars, and PDs that were live, but we recorded on very specific, discrete skills
Mm-hmm.
that students and teachers need to have. So how do you differentiate reading so reading can be accessed? And then what are the tools that you need to do for that? So we wanted to give them kind of like the theoretical framework, yes, but you need to give teachers something very practical at the same time.
Yeah. Yep.
So our approach was really kind of like that simultaneous thing of like, this is the theoretical framework to support ELs. And by the way, this is how you actually replicate that come Monday.
Yep, and here's a tool to allow you to do that a little bit better.
Right.
Yeah, I always like to push. I knew you'd. I just knowing the work that you're doing, I knew you'd have a great answer. But I always love to push people on that. Just that's my background with tech integration, and I've been, certainly in a place where I've said, hey, here's a list of things, try them.
Yeah.
And that just
Right.
that can be overwhelming, especially now.
That was actually our point of entry with the teachers, where we said our department is going to vet all those list of
Yeah.
resources that you have, and how we organize them is on questions like, how do I continue to do this for my students? And by the way, here are the tools that you could use for that. And in some cases, the same tool can fit the need of multiple
For
things,
sure.
right?
Hmm.
But I want them to understand first that these are questions you should be wondering and considerations you're making for your instruction, less about you should use Flipgrid,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah. And Flipgrid may work for one person, it may not work for the other. And
Right.
whatever it takes to get to the end goal, which it sounds like you all have supported and prepared for. And I think it sounds like you're doing a really good job sort of using your EL experts as the experts that they are, and providing those resources to the content teachers, which I think is so important. And collaboration in some ways might be easier now for teachers. And we
Absolutely.
talk about equity. I wonder if, and I'm actually going to ask you, I mean, do you feel like it's a more, the teachers can more sort of equitably access professional development opportunities given the little bit more flexibility that they have with remote learning? Have you seen that or no?
I have to tell you that I felt it's almost, I feel almost guilty saying like there's good things coming out of this because we
Don't feel
know that,
guilty. I think we have to.
because I know that terrible things are happening. But for the first time, I feel that our department can actually reach more teachers and more teachers can access us compared to the past, right? Because in the past, they would have to rely on site specific or district specific, one size fit all professional development. Whereas these days, we're able to customize that, be more flexible with that, have them kind of revisit that learning. We've actually been able to do more professional development, and teachers have been able to access us more this time around in the last 3 months compared to what we've been able to do the last 3 years, right? I
Yeah.
don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, I think both. I mean, obviously the cause of that is not good, but the end result might yield positive results. And the hope is that, things aren't going back to normal anytime in the foreseeable future. But my take on it is, do we really want to go back to normal, or can we learn
Right?
from this and make it better?
Yes.
So it sounds like you have a solid plan in place. I mean, basically what you're going to do, but thinking about the needs of those English learners in particular, how prepared do you think you all are to just pivot if needed? If and when something happens that sort of changes everything,
Hmm.
are you prepared? And what makes you feel prepared or unprepared to make changes if you need to on the fly?
Okay, I would like to say we are prepared, but not certain, right?
I don't think
Because
anyone's certain. That's why I use the word
yeah,
prepared.
because that certainty piece, regardless of how prepared we are, that certainty piece can change at any given time based on the current situation, right? But this is how I kind of like to calm everyone down. Schooling did not become like it wasn't invented on March 13th. We've been doing schools, teaching and learning for a really long time. And over that course of a time, there have been core elements of instruction that we know to be true, research based, effective, and impactful on student learning, right? So long as we keep those core elements in mind as we design what we're going to do, then we know that our heart and our minds are in the right place. And all the other things are logistics that we have to put into place. But I think for however frustrating it is, everyone does understand that things are constantly changing. And many times, especially during this time, it's beyond our control.
Right.
So the best thing that we can do is stay focused on what's best for our students, what are some of those things that we know we need to provide for them, and continue to develop ways to provide that for them.
That's very well said. I mean, there are a lot of people are saying now, and I've said this too, that throw your best practices out the window right now because nobody knows what
Hmm.
best practices are. But if we zoom out a little bit, best
Right,
practices are making sure that we design based on what we know works. And like you said, I think you said everything else is logistics. You're 100% right, and it's the logistics that people get hung up on. And I think a lot of
right,
times people think, oh, these logistics are going to mean that I need to do things differently. Well, yeah, you need to do things differently, but your end goal, if we're all in this for the right reasons and we have been since from the beginning, are going to be the same, right?
correct, correct.
Yeah, that's well said. If you need to hear that again, go ahead and go back to that part because I think you said that really well. Um, is there like an anecdote or a story, something that's happened in your district over the last couple weeks that can kind of illustrate what you're going through right now, maybe a challenge or a triumph or a win or a loss that kind of demonstrates just how crazy it is in your world. I mean, you're sitting here oftentimes behind closed doors with your team. One of the things
Hmm.
we want to do is just really showcase and humanize what you and your colleagues are doing around the country.
Right. I think the most challenging piece right now is kind of the fickleness of families and how their minds and opinions and preferences change as quickly as the newscast changes, you
Yeah.
know? So, we took their pulse back in the spring and they said one thing. We did it again in June. It changed a little bit, not dramatically. But then once we actually asked them, make a selection for the school year, it became very real. So when they were still thinking about it, when it was just a survey, they were saying, this is what I want, this is what I would prefer, this is what my students need. But once we said, we need you to tell us which model you're going to go with for the year, because that's going to help us with programming, scheduling, and staffing, all of a sudden people were like, oh my gosh, this is real, isn't it? I'm going to have to commit for this year. So, how is it that we continue to support their thinking? And I know that a lot of our site principals are doing their own parental and community engagement at the site level so that they can continue to really help parents build their understanding. And it's really just that, build understanding, raise awareness, because it's pointless for you to think that giving them answers is what you need, or satisfying everyone's want is what you need. Those are not the right things to focus on, right? So I think, how is it that we can continue to support families, because I think now more than ever their voices are really loud and are really making a difference on how it is that we are making our plans.
Yeah. That's, you started it off with sort of the fickleness of families, and I knew where you were going to go with that, but that word fickle is a good way to explain it. And I think largely that's because of, I mean, I live in New England, and a saying here is, and I know you said you're from Chicago, so you probably get this too. If you don't like the weather, just wait a minute and it will change, right?
It's going to change,
Well,
yeah.
it's similar to this situation, right? Like, I mean, everybody, we're so used to, since March, just not really knowing what's going to happen next. And so when you send out surveys early, I think you probably get just a quick response, an idea. But then when people start to really think about it, as you mentioned, and say, "Oh, this is real. Like the storm is coming, and when we
Yeah.
need to prepare for it," you might be surprised by what people put down. And the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is you mentioned, when the media comes out, when the news changes, they sort of change their idea. So that's another question I'm curious about that I wanted to ask you. I mean, I think, like, there's this idea that, like, nobody sort of knows what's going to happen with schools, and there's all these sort of, I don't know, myths and realities. So I'd
Hmm.
love to try to separate the myth from the reality. Like, is there something that you're seeing in media or on the news that you feel like is not necessarily reflect a reflection of what's really happening on the ground from your perspective, that may be affecting those sort of changing decisions or changing ideas from parents?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that just came out like this morning. I mean, I know it's come out, but I heard that as recently as this morning, when they say, when the news released that second grader in Georgia, I think, went to school on day one and came home on day two with testing positive for COVID. You see, families, our schools are not prepared, right? And the story behind that people are probably never going to understand or dig into is that, but what were the plans of the school, and how did those return to school plans affect how it is now that you have to quarantine the students, the safety and things like that. I mean, it's not to say that the school was to blame for the student doing that, but like, kind of like, what are your plans after it happens, right? Those are really the things that schools need to think about. So when they say, oh, the school has now to shut down because of the one student, that tells me something, that there was something in the plan that perhaps the school was not prepared for and didn't anticipate in handling. How do we react, and how do we continue school if this were to happen to us? because it's not a realistic response to just say it happens to us and then we shut down, because otherwise you're on and off, right? So I think that thinking about those plans is not always emphasized in the news, how schools and districts are working so hard about thinking about plans and return to school plans, and really thinking about 50 different configurations of how to do that.
Right. And I wonder if that's, I mean, we'll find out in a couple of weeks when we chat with you again. We'll revisit that topic, and I'm guessing that we're going to see more and more of those stories, unfortunately, that don't
Mm-hmm.
really provide the background that people need. And there are schools that are preparing and districts that are preparing better than others, and there'll be some decisions made that probably weren't the right decisions for no, through no fault of anybody making them. It's just the unpredictable nature of everything. But I do think right now, that's for the last 2 weeks, that's the big topic in the news everywhere is all about how schools are going to open. And when there's this kind of frenzy, this media frenzy about things, it's almost
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know, I don't want to be negative, but it's almost like you're looking for something to go wrong so you can
Right,
clamp
right.
down on whatever horrible news you hear and just believe everything. And then it gets perpetuated by rumors and social media. And folks like you are behind the scenes in your district, trying to do the best you can. I think we need to tell those stories. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's really important. So last question, Rowena, and I'm going to ask everybody this question, I think probably every time we chat. Where are you getting your inspiration from right now? Like, what is keeping you going? Is there something that you would advice that you would give to others, place to go to
Mm-hmm.
kind of keep yourselves sort of energized and inspired?
Yeah. I am really hopeful for what can come out of this with respect to schooling that we've been thinking about and talking about for the longest time, right? So, for the longest time, we've said schools are not equitable for all kids. Learning has to be individualized. Students have to learn at their pace and supported at that. There needs to be more emphasis on social emotional learning. Students need to be agents of their learning. I think for the first time, we're figuring out ways to do that in this environment, right? Because how is it that I'm going to do that in distance learning, make it flexible, make it accessible, have synchronous and asynchronous learning sessions and things like that? Teachers are finding that out. And I think maybe not right after this, but over time, I think we're going to realize for high schools, for instance, the hybrid model. Do they have to go to all 1 hour classes 6 times a day? Is that really the best time and the best way to spend their school day? Is there a way to kind of split that on block periods, but at the end of the day, have built in time for intervention? So those were things that we were tinking around with for the longest time, but we didn't think that we could. And so I think for the first time, we're given the opportunity to kind of reinvent that, rethink that. So that's really where I'm getting my inspiration from. And of course, from teachers. Their renewed spirit and creativity and innovation really, really inspire me. Teachers that didn't trust themselves with technology, teachers that didn't think that they could do this. And all of a sudden, on week 2, they have Google Classroom set up with all of its bells and whistles. In some cases, those are teachers who are about to retire. So you have teachers there that, from day one, I have been in this for the right reason, and I'm going to continue to do that for the right reason. And I know there are way more examples of that we're not hearing from, because we tend to be hearing about the negative these days. But I know that those are going on. I have personal anecdotes of that. I have experienced that myself. So that renewed opportunity and reinventing teaching and learning and schooling in general for students, I'm very inspired. I'm really excited what can come out of this.
Yeah, so your inspiration comes from what you're seeing with teachers and the long game of what's going to happen next, which I think is really important. And I am quite sure, just based on this first conversation, that we'll hear a lot more inspiring things from you as we follow you and what Saddleback is doing over the next couple months. But I wanted to thank you for taking the time for this first episode with you on the In This Together docuseries. It's clear that you're very passionate about what you do. It's contagious, and I'm really appreciative of having you on.
Thank you, Steve.